Thank you, Phoebe. That was great. The week before last, I took a few days of study leave to go on a retreat near the shores of Lake Superior. The retreat was led by a minister I know, and by design, I was the only attendee. For 3 days and nights, I stayed in a guest apartment that the minister and her husband have created above their garage. It's a great space for writing and for the solo and guided reflections that were part of my retreat. The apartment is very Northwoods, very Scandinavian, with nice, simple furniture, lots of knotty pine, and views of trees out every window. I found the apartment comfortable and very relaxing, except for one thing. The apartment had a lot of places where I could bump my head. Now, when I'm wearing shoes, the top of my head is about 6 feet 3 inches from the floor. This is generally not a source of concern. My home, and especially my workplace, have very generous ceilings and doors. But even with a high ceiling in the middle, this retreat apartment was a bit of an obstacle course. The ceiling sloped down pretty steeply on one side, meaning that I couldn't fully stand up in front of the fridge or the toilet. The bathroom doorway was on the short side, the kitchen lights came down to my forehead, and I had to weave around the dangling pull chains for the ceiling fans. Even the garden gate outside had a low-hanging piece of decorative ironwork. And unlike some tall people, I do not have a head of hair to serve as an early warning system or a protective cushion. So whenever I was moving around the apartment, I had to look up and pay attention, at least until my brain developed a map and patterns and habits to accommodate my body to this new environment. The ceiling fan chains did get me a couple of times, and there were 1 or 2 minor brushes with some of the knotty pine. But overall, I adapted and had a very worthwhile retreat. And one thing I noticed is that I never blamed my body. I never lamented that I was too tall, because there's nothing wrong with me or my height. It's just that not everything is built for someone like me. My approach has always been to be grateful for my height. I've never wished to be shorter, even when my femurs seemed too long for certain airline seats, or when stores stopped carrying pants that I could wear. I am not poorly designed, and neither are you, for that matter. It's just that some things in the world around me weren't designed with me in mind. Our theme this month at the First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis is cultivating relationship. And today I want to talk about a relationship we all have, a relationship with our bodies. Unitarian Universalists and Humanists have a reputation for wanting to deal mainly with matters of the mind and brain, diving into philosophy, analyzing history and current events, and strategizing about social justice. And we tend to do these preferred activities without much active participation of our bodies. It's hard to go for a walk and read a theology book at the same time. The Unitarian side of our heritage in particular is sometimes thought of as a religion from the neck up. All brain, no heart, no body. That's why I've called this talk From the Neck Down, to give some consideration to the rest of what makes us human. Whether we pay attention to them or not, our bodies are inevitable, often a blessing and sometimes a burden. And I want to explore that relationship today, because it's a relationship that 100% of us have, and it's often changing and challenging. I want to talk just a bit more about my experience of being a person of above average height. My attitude toward being tall illustrates what I think of as externalized antipathy. Externalized antipathy. Now, not that one wants a lot of antipathy in one's life, but on the occasions that my body has had a hard time fitting into the environment around it, I'm grateful that I've decided that the environment is the problem and not my body. My legs are as long as they are. The airlines that try to cram people of all lengths and widths into the same seats created the problem, not me. And so while I might have moments of feeling physically uncomfortable, I don't feel badly about myself. And it helps that height, for whatever reason, is considered a positive attribute, generally free of the stigma and free of the misplaced moralizing directed at other kinds of bodies. And since tomorrow is National Coming Out Day, I'll say that this kind of externalizing extends to my being gay. Even back when I was a teen struggling with the idea of coming out, even while I was living in fear of what it would mean for my life, I never at core felt that I was bad or had anything to be ashamed of. Like a poorly laid out airplane, it was the world that needed improving. The world has improved since those days, but it still needs fixing to make room for all of us beautiful LGBTQ+ people. We and our bodies and our desires and our identities are not the problem. I've experienced a lot of learning about the body in recent years, and one of the areas of growth for me has been around ableism and disabilities. A number of people living with disabilities hold a perspective that bears some resemblance to what I've been talking about, that the bigger problem is the world. In an online article last year, the writer Andrew Polrang, who has multiple lifelong disabilities, had this to say about the challenges. Many disabled people find that most of these hardships come from other people and the environment they live in, not their disabilities themselves. It can help to think of a pie chart, Polrang explains. For each person at different times, there's a different ratio between direct suffering from a disability and indirect hardships imposed by other people's ableism, by systemic failures, and by a lack of accessibility. Some days, chronic back pain or sudden muscle spasms or loss of mobility is much worse than the physical barriers or interpersonal ableism. Other times, he says, we can cope well with our impairments, but struggle to gain access to the places we need to go, and struggle to process emotionally the onslaughts of insensitive ableist comments that can come seemingly out of nowhere. He continues, there is absolutely a lot that disabled people endure and have to work through, but much of it is entirely unnecessary pressure from the outside. Disability hardships are real, but they don't have to be. Polrang also makes clear that layers of privilege can lead to vastly different outcomes in life situations for any two people with seemingly comparable disabilities. More disabled people, he says, could be independent and happy if their material and social conditions were improved. Polrang is one of several writers who have helped me examine my own views of disabilities. He talks about what he calls, quote, the mistaken and corrosive notion that disability is fundamentally a natural tragedy to be overcome. It is not, he says. I have to acknowledge to having my mind expanded by this perspective, the idea of framing a disability as a neutral or even positive difference, like having long legs. Framing it as a neutral or even positive difference rather than a problem in need of fixing. I've also learned a few things from the phrase temporarily able-bodied, which is used to describe people who are not considered to be living with disabilities. Saying temporarily able-bodied is a good reminder of the tentative nature of everything, and of the reality that all of our bodies have limits. As disability advocate and business owner Sean Crump puts it, the question is, when will the barriers in our community impact your life? When? Such a question might be helpful for closing any perceived distance between those with disabilities and those without. Another way that the temporarily able-bodied can help close that distance is to think twice before describing a person with disabilities as an inspiration. I've heard this from a number of friends and writers with disabilities. And there's a Netflix series called Special, which was written by and stars Ryan O'Connell, a young gay man with cerebral palsy. It's a very funny and, I'll let you know, a very sex-positive show, and it also takes on serious issues. There's a gut punch scene in which a very fit, temporarily able-bodied man tells Ryan how inspiring Ryan is, just for going to the gym. Just as Polrang described, it's an insensitive ableist remark seeming to come out of nowhere. Ryan feels reduced to his disability and seen only for his disability. This kind of thing is often called inspiration porn. It's an opportunity for the able-bodied to feel like they've done a good deed by effectively patting a disabled person on the head. They simultaneously distance themselves from any bodily differences by othering the disabled person. There is a human tendency to back away from anything perceived as an illness or infirmity of the body, and a tendency to create hierarchies of humanity to feel better about one's own fate. Being disabled is one of the billion possible ways of being human, my friend the Reverend Teresa Soto says. She describes her own disabilities as factory installed. She's always had them, and they're a part of who she is. She's fully human, and in the words of the story we heard earlier, she rocks what she's got, and she rocks it a lot. And, Reverend Teresa says, she imagines supportive, inclusive futures for everyone. It is possible, she writes, for us together to keep shifting frameworks that devalue other people's human experiences, so that if someone should become disabled, the future that awaits them doesn't require them to struggle or do everything in the hardest possible way. Now, I realize that by titling this talk From the Neck Down, I may be seen as reinforcing the famous Cartesian perspective of mind-body dualism. The idea that the mind and body are separate and very different in nature. But please know that I do not consider there to be a bright line between the body and the mind. It's actually a little surprising to me that this duality has persisted so strongly to the present day, considering the progress of scientific knowledge. Right now, I'm reading a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which was recommended to me by our young adult group here at FUS. The book's author, Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, tells of how 140 years ago, our friend Charles Darwin wrote a book about human and animal emotions and their similarities. Darwin described the actions and reactions between the mind and the viscera, which he called the two most important organs in the body. He sort of considered the middle of the body as one organ. And he talked about the nerves that wire everything together. Dr. van der Kolk praises Darwin's forward-thinking and all-encompassing approach. And he points out that emotions have the power to cause physical pain in the body. Stomach aches, headaches, muscle tension, we're all aware of these things. And he reminds us that physical pain in turn affects our emotions. Until recently, van der Kolk writes, this bidirectional communication between body and mind was largely ignored by Western science, even as it had long been central to traditional healing practices in many parts of the world, notably India and China. One might note that the white and Christian world, with its view of the body as sinful and the soul as a separate entity, helped perpetuate this dualism. But there is now a broadening understanding that so much of how we react to life and how we feel our humanity happens outside of our minds. That it has taken so long is a reminder of our denial of the body's importance and of our negative views of the body. The problem of ableism is rooted in our own fears about our own bodies. The attention we pay to ourselves from the neck down also has taken on another meaning in the pandemic era. With so much of life, school, and white-collar employment now taking place online, many of our bodies are getting ignored in two ways. One, a typical Zoom meeting is truly a bunch of people as seen from the neck up. It's a gallery of heads and faces in boxes, with the rest of the body deemed extraneous. The body is unnecessary, except as a support structure for your head, and maybe as a way to press the unmute button if your brain remembers. Many of us have spent much of our days during the pandemic appearing disembodied. And that has led to a second kind of ignoring the body. In the online world, there is almost no requirement to move your body. Office workers used to go from desk to meeting room to cafeteria and back. Social justice advocates used to run all over town to get to different meetings for different causes and different communities. Now, except for taking care of a few bodily necessities, a person can spend 8 hours or 16 hours in the same chair at the same screen with tired eyes and muscles that have fallen asleep for lack of purpose. Anyone predisposed to ignore one's body may forget about it entirely until numbness sets in. And as Van der Kolk reminds us in The Body Keeps the Score, human bodies are designed not only to move frequently, but also to be in the physical presence of other human bodies. We're wired that way from birth. It's one of the factory presets. So for many people, the virtual experience has been only partly fulfilling. Information and words and feelings may be shared, and for some people that occurs more easily online than in person. And there is a lot of value in that kind of connection. I've learned this from leading grief groups and writing sessions and coffee hours online. And actually, much of my seminary education took place remotely. But my seminary still made everyone come to Chicago several times a year, because there is still power in a physical room full of people. At the same time, gathering electronically and being disembodied can offer the benefit of removing a number of barriers to participation. I chose my seminary in part because I didn't have to move to another city. And folks who want to see what we're up to here at FUS on a Sunday morning don't have to overcome mobility challenges or snowy sidewalks. They don't even have to be available on Sunday morning or live nearby. They can still enjoy some levels of participation. Thanks to our incredibly dedicated tech team, this was actually an option before the pandemic. And it's become an even more important and permanent part of how we do things. And for those who want embodied in-person experiences with their fellow members of the congregation, we're offering new kinds of outdoor social activities for now, like a chili cook-off and nature outings. And we're offering opportunities to take part in justice events like last weekend's Bands Off Our Bodies March. That march was itself a protest of the way certain politicians are hijacking individuals' relationships with their own bodies. So politically, medically, interpersonally, intrapersonally, bodies can be so complicated. Maybe that's part of what's behind the dualism and the minimization. Bodies are a lot to deal with. Best to put them somewhere else. But we don't really have that choice. Having a body is, at least for now, the only way to go through this experience we call life. Fortunately, as Reverend Teresa said, there are a billion possible ways of being human. May each of us find the way that fits best, and may all of us work toward a world of greater inclusion for the bodies of all, so that all may fit in anywhere they choose. May it be so.